Sometimes the best deals in life come with the highest price. Clara Dawson learned this the hard way when she bought an abandoned cabin for $1 at a county auction. Living alone in the Colorado mountains, Clara trusted two things: her own hands and her German shepherd, Flint. She didn't believe in ghost stories. When the old cabin went up for auction, she saw good timber and stone for her homestead. $1 seemed like a steal, but Flint refused to enter. The loyal dog planted his feet at the threshold, growling at shadows Clara couldn't see. His hackles rose as he paced the rotting porch. When he started digging frantically beneath the warped boards, Clara realized the townsfolk's warnings about Ash Hollow weren't just small-town gossip. What terrible secret had been buried here for generations? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before the auction that would change everything. Clara Dawson stood on her cabin porch, watching the morning mist rise from Pine Valley below. In her left hand, she gripped her father's walking stick, a piece of mountain ash he'd carved when she was 10, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. The stick had been with her through every major decision since his death 8 years ago. A tangible connection to the man who taught her that the mountains provided everything a person truly needed. At 40, Clara had spent her entire life in these Colorado peaks. Born in the same cabin where she now lived alone, she'd never known her mother, who died bringing her into the world during a fierce winter storm. Her father, Robert Dawson, had raised her with the quiet wisdom of a man who understood that grief and joy often walked hand in hand through life. He taught her to hunt, to read the weather in cloud formations, to carve wood into useful things, and most importantly, to trust her instincts above all else. The cabin reflected her practical nature. Every board had been mended by her own hands, every window pane replaced when storms demanded it. She heated with wood, she split herself, grew vegetables in a garden carved from rocky soil, and preserved enough food each fall to last through the harshest winters. Her refrigerator ran on propane, her lights on solar panels Robert had installed in his final years. She owned no television, no computer, no smartphone, only an old radio that connected her to the outside world when weather allowed clear signals. Flint padded onto the porch beside her, his thick coat still damp from their morning patrol of the property line. The German shepherd had appeared at her door 3 winters ago, half-starved, and bearing old scars that spoke of hard living. Clara had fed him, expecting him to move on when his strength returned. Instead, he'd simply stayed, as if recognizing a kindred spirit who understood solitude. They developed an easy partnership built on mutual respect and few words. Flint alerted her to wildlife, helped track wounded deer, and provided the kind of loyal companionship that asked for nothing but presence. "Time for supplies," Clara told him, scratching behind his ears. Flint's tail wagged once, his economical way of expressing enthusiasm. The drive to Pine Ridge took an hour on winding mountain roads. Clara's pickup truck, like everything else she owned, served function over form. The blue paint had faded to gray in places. The tailgate bore dents from hauling firewood, and the bench seat held the comfortable depression left by years of use. But the engine ran strong, the tires gripped mountain curves, and the heater worked, everything that mattered. Pine Ridge had grown since her childhood, but not by much. The main street still held the same handful of businesses: Morrison's General Store, the Pine Cone Diner, Hartley's Hardware, and the post office that doubled as an informal community center. Most residents knew Clara by sight, though few knew her well. She conducted her business efficiently and politely, neither seeking conversation nor avoiding it when it came naturally. Morrison's General Store smelled of coffee, leather goods, and the indefinable mixture of items that accumulate in a place serving scattered mountain residents. Clara moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, gathering flour, salt, coffee, and the few items she couldn't produce or preserve herself. At the counter, she nodded to Bill Morrison, a man her father's age who'd run the store for 30 years. "Heard about the county auction next week," Bill said as he rang up her purchases. Some interesting properties coming up, that's so. Clara counted out exact change. Not particularly interested in small talk. Old Ash Hollow place is finally going to auction. Dollar minimum bid, can you believe that? Bill shook his head. Course, there's a reason nobody wants it. Despite herself, Clara's attention sharpened. She knew the location, a patch of land about 5 miles from her own property, near an old mining road that hadn't seen regular use in decades. What kind of reason? Bill leaned forward conspiratorially, though the store held only 2 other customers. That place has got a history, Clara. Bad history. Every family that's tried to make a go of it has left within months. Sometimes in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind. Probably just poor construction, Clara said. Oh, places have problems. Maybe. Bill's tone suggested he didn't agree. But when 3 different families tell the same stories about cold spots and voices in the walls, a sensible person starts to wonder. Clara accepted her change and receipt. Sensible people don't put stock in ghost stories. Your daddy ever tell you about what happened up there in the old mining days? The mention of her father gave Clara pause. Robert Dawson had known every local story, every piece of mountain history worth knowing. But he'd never mentioned Ash Hollow specifically. No, he didn't. Might be worth looking into. You decide to bid on it. That timber's good. Cabin's got to be 120 years old at least. Good salvage value if nothing else. Clara nodded and headed for the door. But Bill's voice stopped her. Just remember, Clara, sometimes the cheapest price comes with the highest cost. Outside, she loaded her supplies into the truck while considering Bill's words. A cabin for $1 minimum bid did seem unusual, even for property in poor condition. But Clara had grown up hearing every local legend and tall tale. Ghost stories sold well around campfires, but poorly in daylight. If the structure held good timber and stone, $1 investment could provide materials worth hundreds. The drive home took her past the turnoff to Ash Hollow Road. On impulse, she slowed and looked down the overgrown track that wound between tall pines toward what had once been mining country. The road looked passable, though barely. She could see tire tracks from the county assessor's recent visit, but they were already being reclaimed by mountain vegetation. Back at her cabin, Clara unpacked supplies while Flint supervised from his favorite spot near the wood stove. The afternoon routine of chores, splitting kindling, checking the garden, maintaining tools, usually provided the kind of meditative satisfaction that made her chosen life worthwhile. But today, her thoughts kept returning to Bill Morrison's words and the curious case of a property nobody wanted. That evening, she sat on her porch as she did most nights, watching stars emerge in the clear mountain air. Her father's walking stick rested against her knee, and Flint lay stretched across her feet, providing warmth against the autumn chill. These quiet moments had always been enough, the kind of simple contentment that asked nothing from the world beyond what it freely offered. "What do you think, Dad?" she asked the darkness, a habit she'd maintained since his death. Good timber worth the risk of local gossip? The wind through the pines provided no answer, but Clara had already made her decision. She'd attend the auction, not out of curiosity about ghost stories, but because waste offended her practical nature. If good materials were available for reasonable cost, she'd put them to better use than letting them rot in the wilderness. The next morning brought the first hard frost of the season. Clara woke to find ice crystals covering her windows in delicate patterns that would melt within an hour of sunrise. She dressed in layers, wool shirt, fleece vest, canvas jacket, and stepped outside to breathe air so cold it stung her lungs. Flint emerged from the old horse shed where he'd claimed a bed of straw, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. They walked the property line together, a daily ritual that let Clara check for storm damage, animal problems, or any changes that required attention. The routine grounded her in the practical demands of mountain living: fence posts to repair, deadfall to clear, water lines to insulate before winter deepened. These tasks had shaped her life since childhood, creating the kind of competence that came from necessity rather than choice. At the furthest corner of her property, Clara paused where her land bordered the old mining road that led toward Ash Hollow. From here, She could just make out the tops of buildings through the trees, or what remained of buildings after decades of abandonment. The sight stirred something she couldn't quite name, a mixture of curiosity and unease that felt foreign to her usually straightforward nature. Flint whined softly beside her. His ears pricked toward the distant structures. The sound surprised Clara. Her dog rarely showed uncertainty about anything. She looked down at him, noting the tension in his body language, the way his hackles had begun to rise slightly. "What is it, boy?" But Flint only pressed closer to her leg, his attention fixed on something Clara couldn't see or sense. After a moment he turned and headed back toward their cabin, leaving Clara to follow with a growing sense that the auction might bring more than she'd bargained for. 3 days later, she would learn just how right that feeling had been. The county auction took place in the parking lot behind Pine Ridge's municipal building, a modest brick structure that housed the sheriff's office, town clerk, and meeting room that served multiple civic functions. Clara arrived 30 minutes early, parking her truck at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered despite the October cold. She counted maybe 20 people, a typical turnout for rural property auctions, where most bidders came seeking hunting land or timber rights. The auctioneer, a weathered man named Pete Franklin, who'd been conducting county sales for 15 years, stood behind a folding table covered with property documents and legal notices. His voice carried easily across the parking lot as he explained the terms: cash sales only, properties sold as is, buyers responsible for all inspections and title research. Clara listened with half her attention while studying the other potential bidders. She recognized most faces: local contractors looking for salvage materials, a few developers from the valley seeking recreational properties, and several neighbors whose presence suggested casual curiosity rather than serious intent to purchase. Nobody seemed particularly interested in the Ash Hollow property, which came up fourth on the auction list. "Next item," Franklin announced, consulting his documents. "Parcel number 47B, commonly known as the Ash Hollow cabin and surrounding 40 acres. Property includes one residential structure, outbuildings and mineral rights. Minimum bid $1. A murmur ran through the crowd. Even for distressed property, $1 minimum was unusually low. Clara raised her hand. $1 from the lady in the blue jacket, Franklin called. He waited 30 seconds, scanning the crowd for competing bids. Going once, going twice, sold for $1 to bidder number 12. The transaction took less than 2 minutes. Clara paid her $1 plus $43 in county fees, received a receipt and temporary deed, and found herself the owner of property she'd never actually seen up close. The entire process felt anticlimactic, like buying groceries rather than real estate. An hour later, she stood at the entrance to Ash Hollow Road with Flint beside her, studying the overgrown track that led to her new property. The road showed recent tire marks from the county assessor's visit, but vegetation had already begun reclaiming the edges. Tall pines pressed close on both sides, their shadows creating a tunnel effect that blocked most of the afternoon sunlight. Clara had brought tools: chainsaw, axe, crowbar, measuring tape, expecting to find a structure in poor condition but potentially useful for salvage. She'd also brought Flint, partly for company and partly because his presence made any exploration feel safer. Not that she expected danger, but old buildings could hide hazards from rotted floors to unstable walls. They walked the quarter-mile track slowly. Clara, noting where recent rains had washed out sections of the roadbed and where fallen branches would need clearing before she could bring her truck closer to the cabin. The isolation felt complete. No sound of traffic, no sign of human presence except the fading marks left by county vehicles. The cabin appeared suddenly as they rounded a bend in the road. Clara stopped, surprised by how well preserved it looked from a distance. The structure was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories with a full porch and what appeared to be several outbuildings scattered around a natural clearing. The roof showed missing shingles and obvious weather damage, but the walls stood straight and the foundation looked solid. Flint's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The dog froze beside her, every muscle tense, his lips pulling back to reveal his teeth. A low growl rumbled from his chest, not the warning sound he made for wildlife, but something deeper and more unsettled. "Easy, boy," Clara said. But Flint's agitation only increased as they approached the cabin. By the time they reached the porch steps, Flint had planted his feet and refused to go further. His growling had become a continuous sound, punctuated by whines that spoke of genuine distress. Clara had never seen him behave this way. Even encountering bears or mountain lions, Flint maintained his composure. This was different, a fear that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than survival instinct. Clara climbed the porch steps alone, testing each board before trusting it with her full weight. The wood felt solid enough, though years of weather had left the surface warped and splintered. She tried the front door and found it unlocked, the handle turning easily despite obvious corrosion. The interior struck her immediately as wrong, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The cabin had been abandoned hastily. Furniture remained covered by dust sheets, personal items scattered on tables and shelves, dishes still in the kitchen sink. But something about the arrangement felt deliberate, as if the former occupants had been preparing for something specific rather than simply moving away. Every doorway showed lines of salt across the threshold, now scattered and dirty but clearly visible. Strange symbols had been carved into the wooden beams. Not decorative patterns, but crude markings that looked urgent, almost desperate. Scratches covered the interior walls at shoulder height. Too regular to be accidental damage, but too chaotic to be intentional decoration. Clara explored room by room, her practical eye cataloguing useful materials, while her instincts registered details that didn't fit normal patterns of abandonment. In the kitchen, she found religious medallions nailed above the windows. In the parlor, mirrors had been turned to face the walls. Upstairs, bedrooms showed evidence of sleepless nights. Blankets pulled away from windows, furniture pushed against doors. Outside, Flint's distress had escalated to the point where Clara could hear him through the cabin walls. She'd never known him to maintain such sustained agitation. Whatever was affecting him seemed to be getting stronger rather than weaker as time passed. She rejoined him on the porch, noting how his tension decreased the moment she emerged from the cabin, but didn't disappear entirely. Flint paced the length of the porch, pausing frequently to stare at specific points along the foundation, as if tracking movement Clara couldn't detect. "What is it?" she asked, following his gaze, but seeing only weathered wood and stone. Flint's response was to begin digging frantically at the base of the porch steps, his claws scraping against hard-packed earth and rotting wood. The behavior was so unlike him that Clara knelt beside him, trying to see what had captured his attention. Her hands found loose earth beneath the lowest step, soil that felt different from the surrounding ground, softer, more recently disturbed. Flint's digging had exposed something metallic, a dull glint that caught the late afternoon light. Clara used her fingers to carefully excavate around the object, gradually revealing an old skeleton key made of iron. Its surface pitted with rust, but still intact. The key was heavier than she'd expected, its design suggesting considerable age. The head bore decorative scrollwork that time had worn smooth, while the shaft showed the kind of precise craftsmanship that belonged to an earlier era. Clara turned it over in her palm, noting that despite the rust, the mechanism appeared functional. Flint's agitation reached a peak the moment Clara touched the key. He backed away from her, whining continuously, his eyes fixed on the metal object as if it posed immediate danger. The dog, who had never shown fear of anything, not thunderstorms, not predators, not machinery, was clearly terrified of what they'd just uncovered. Clara stood slowly, the key cold against her palm, despite the afternoon warmth. Around them, the forest had grown unusually quiet. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no whisper of wind through the pine branches. Even the natural settling sounds of the old cabin had ceased, leaving a silence so complete it felt oppressive. She looked back at the cabin with new eyes, noting details that had seemed merely odd before, but now suggested something more disturbing. The salt lines, the carved symbols, The furniture arrangements all spoke of people trying to protect themselves from something they couldn't explain, but definitely feared. The key in her hand seemed to pulse with its own weight, as if it held significance beyond its physical properties. Clara had no idea what it might unlock. She'd seen no corresponding lock in the cabin, no door or container that would require such an old-fashioned key. But Flint's reaction suggested it was important in ways that transcended its obvious function. As the sun began to set behind the pines, Clara made the decision to leave. Whatever had frightened 3 different families away from this place was affecting her dog, and she trusted Flint's instincts more than her own curiosity. But she kept the key, slipping it into her jacket pocket, where its weight served as a constant reminder that her $1 purchase had brought her more than timber and stone. The walk back to her truck felt longer than the journey in. Though Clara knew the distance hadn't changed, Flint stayed close beside her, glancing back frequently toward the cabin, as if expecting pursuit. Not until they'd driven several miles toward home did his posture relax, and even then he remained more alert than usual. That night, Clara sat on her own porch with the key in her hand, turning it over in the lamplight while trying to understand what she'd gotten herself into. For the first time in her adult life, her practical worldview felt insufficient to explain what she'd experienced. The key seemed to watch her as the darkness deepened around Pine Valley, carrying secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. Clara spent the next morning examining the key by daylight, searching for any markings that might indicate its origin or purpose. The iron showed considerable age, probably 19th century, based on the craftsmanship and patina. The decorative scrollwork on the head had been executed by hand rather than machine, suggesting it had been made for something important rather than everyday use. But what truly unsettled her was how the key felt warm to the touch, regardless of the ambient temperature. Even sitting on her kitchen table overnight, it retained a subtle heat that seemed to come from within the metal itself. Clara had worked with iron her entire life, tools, hardware, decorative pieces her father had forged, and she'd never encountered anything like this. Flint refused to enter any room where the key was present. The dog, who normally followed her everywhere, now maintained careful distance, watching her with worried eyes, but declining to approach when she held the mysterious object. His behavior provided the most compelling evidence that something about their discovery transcended normal explanation. By afternoon, Clara had made her decision. She would return to Ash Hollow with proper tools and conduct a systematic search for whatever the key was meant to open. Her practical nature demanded logical investigation rather than speculation, and she'd learned long ago that mystery could usually be solved through methodical effort. The drive back to the cabin felt different in daylight. The road seemed less threatening, the forest more welcoming. Even Flint appeared calmer, though he remained alert in ways that suggested continued unease rather than acceptance. Clara parked closer to the cabin this time, confident that the roadbed would support her truck's weight. Inside the cabin, she began her search systematically, room by room. The key's size and style suggested it belonged to a door, chest, or cabinet from the late 1800s. She examined every piece of furniture, every door and window, every built-in feature that might conceal a lock. The downstairs yielded nothing, nor did the upstairs bedrooms. In the basement, accessed through a narrow stairway behind the kitchen, Clara found what appeared to be a root cellar that had been converted into storage space. The stone walls showed the kind of careful construction that marked serious building, thick foundations meant to last generations. Shelves lined the walls, most empty now, but showing evidence of long use for preserving food and storing household necessities. Here, beneath a workbench in the far corner, Clara's flashlight beam caught the glint of metal. A small, square door had been set into the stone foundation at floor level, its surface nearly invisible unless viewed from the correct angle. The lock was old iron, matching the style of the key she carried. Flint had followed her into the basement reluctantly, and his agitation increased dramatically as Clara approached the hidden door. He positioned himself at the bottom of the stairs, whining softly but clearly prepared to bolt if necessary. His fear was so palpable that Clara hesitated before inserting the key into the lock. The mechanism turned easily despite its age, releasing with a click that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a space about 2 feet square and perhaps 18 inches deep. Inside, Clara found a metal box wrapped in oiled cloth and what appeared to be several rolled documents tied with twine. The metal box contained items that spoke of careful preservation: photographs, letters, and what looked like pages torn from a journal. The documents had been protected from moisture and decay, their contents still clearly legible despite obvious age. Clara gathered everything carefully, noting how the materials seemed to have been placed deliberately rather than hidden in haste. Outside, in the fading afternoon light, Clara spread her discoveries on the tailgate of her truck while Flint watched from a safe distance. The photographs showed a family from the 1940s. Parents and 2 children posed formally for what was probably a special occasion. The man wore a military uniform, suggesting the images dated from around World War II. The journal pages told a more disturbing story. Written in careful handwriting that suggested education and deliberation, they documented a family's gradual descent into fear. September 15th, 1943. Moved into the cabin today. Robert says the isolation will be good for the children after everything they've been through in the city. The place feels peaceful, though Helen mentions cold spots in the parlor that don't seem to have any source. September 28th, 1943. Strange sounds at night. Footsteps on the porch when everyone is accounted for inside. Robert checked twice, but found no evidence of intruders. The children are sleeping poorly. October 12th, 1943. Helen refuses to go into the basement alone. Says she hears voices coming from the walls. I've examined every inch and found nothing unusual, but her fear is genuine. The cold spots have spread to other rooms. October 30th, 1943. Little Mary claims there's a lady in her room at night who talks to her about the mine. We've told her repeatedly that no mine exists near here, but she insists the lady shows her things that happened before. Robert is talking about leaving. November 8th, 1943. Found Mary sleepwalking toward the trees behind the cabin. She was heading for something she called the dark place where the lady lives. When we followed her path in the morning, we discovered what appears to be a sealed mine entrance about a quarter mile into the forest. How did she know it was there? The entries ended abruptly there, as if the family had left immediately after the final incident. Clara read them twice, noting the progression from skepticism to growing concern to apparent terror. The writing remained steady throughout, suggesting these weren't the fantasies of an unstable mind, but the careful documentation of someone trying to understand increasingly disturbing events. The sealed mine mentioned in the final entry explained much about the cabin's history. Mining operations in Colorado during the late 1800s had often been abandoned suddenly when veins played out or geological conditions became dangerous. If the mine had been the site of accidents or deaths, local folklore might easily transform historical tragedy into supernatural legend. But the journal writer's description of his daughter's behavior, her knowledge of the mine's location, her references to events before, suggested something more complex than simple local history. Clara found herself remembering Flint's immediate and sustained fear, his refusal to approach certain areas around the cabin. The other documents included property records dating back to the 1880s, showing a chain of ownership that painted a picture of repeated abandonment. The Morrison family had lasted 8 months in 1943. The Hendricks family had stayed only 4 months in 1978. A family named Patterson had tried to make it work in 1995, but left after 6 weeks. Each abandonment followed the same pattern documented in the Morrison Journal: initial satisfaction with the property, gradual awareness of unexplained phenomena, escalating fear, and finally hasty departure, leaving most possessions behind. The pattern was too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, too well documented to explain as imagination. Clara gathered the documents carefully, her practical mind working to process information that challenged everything she thought she understood about the world. The key in her pocket felt heavier now, weighted with the knowledge that it had unlocked more than just a hidden compartment. It had opened a door to questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Flint's relief was obvious when they finally left the cabin, but Clara noticed he kept glancing back as they drove away, as if checking to make sure they weren't being followed. His behavior reinforced her growing conviction that whatever had driven away 3 families was still present at Ash Hollow, still waiting. That evening, Clara sat at her kitchen table studying the journal pages by lamplight, trying to reconcile their contents with her lifelong skepticism about supernatural claims. The writing was too detailed, too consistent, too rational to dismiss as fantasy. But accepting it as factual meant acknowledging possibilities that contradicted her fundamental understanding of how the world worked. The mine mentioned in the final entry offered a potential explanation, rooted in historical rather than supernatural causes. Mining accidents had been common in Colorado during the late 1800s, often involving cave-ins, gas explosions, or flooding that killed entire crews. If such a tragedy had occurred near the cabin, it might explain why subsequent residents experienced disturbances. But that explanation felt insufficient to account for the specific details documented in the Morrison Journal, a child's impossible knowledge, voices in the walls. The consistent pattern of fear that had driven away multiple families across different decades. Clara closed the journal and looked out her window toward the distant mountains that concealed Ash Hollow. For the first time in her adult life, she felt unprepared to handle a problem through practical action alone. Whatever waited in the darkness beyond her property line required understanding that went beyond carpentry, hunting, or mountain survival skills. The key lay on the table before her, somehow still warm despite the evening chill, carrying secrets she was only beginning to comprehend. Clara returned to Ash Hollow the next morning with a specific mission: find the sealed mine mentioned in the Morrison Journal. If understanding the cabin's history required confronting whatever had happened in that mine, she would approach it methodically rather than flee from ignorance. Flint accompanied her reluctantly, his posture tense but determined to stay close to her side. The search for the mine began at the tree line behind the cabin, following the path little Mary Morrison had taken during her sleepwalking episode in 1943. Clara found traces of an old trail, barely visible after decades of forest growth, but still discernible to someone who knew how to read the land. Game trails overlaid the original path, but the route showed signs of human modification: cleared branches, worn earth. Stones moved to create easier passage. Flint's behavior grew more agitated as they penetrated deeper into the forest. His ears remained fixed forward, tracking sounds Clara couldn't hear, and his hackles rose in waves as if responding to some unseen presence that moved around them. But he stayed with her, loyalty overcoming fear in the way that marked him as an exceptional companion. The mine entrance appeared after a quarter-mile walk, exactly as the journal had described. Someone had sealed it with concrete and steel plates, creating a barrier that looked both official and permanent. Warning signs posted by the county declared the area hazardous and prohibited unauthorized entry. But the sealing work showed obvious age, rust stains on the metal, weathering in the concrete that suggested decades of exposure. Clara examined the barrier carefully, noting that while it appeared solid, the concrete had developed hairline cracks and the steel plates had separated slightly in places. The construction looked hastily done, as if the priority had been speed rather than permanence. Behind the barriers, she could sense open space. The mine definitely extended into the mountain, though she couldn't determine how far. Most disturbing was what she found scattered around the mine entrance. Flowers, obviously placed recently, lay wilted against the concrete barrier. Not wildflowers, but cultivated varieties that someone had brought deliberately, roses, lilies, and others that spoke of memorial rather than accident. Someone was still visiting this place, still remembering whatever had happened here. Flint refused to approach within 20 feet of the sealed entrance. He positioned himself at what seemed to be his comfort zone and whined continuously, his eyes fixed on the barriers as if watching for movement. Clara had never seen him sustain such focused attention on any stationary object. The walk back to the cabin provided time to process what she'd discovered. The mine clearly held significance beyond simple geological hazard. The memorial flowers suggested ongoing tragedy, while its mention in the Morrison Journal implied some connection to the supernatural disturbances that had driven away multiple families. But understanding that connection required more information than she possessed. At the cabin, Clara conducted a more thorough search of the remaining rooms, looking for additional hidden compartments or documents. In the fireplace, she discovered something the previous day's search had missed: pieces of a partially burned photograph wedged behind the damper. The fragments were badly damaged, but still showed recognizable images: a woman and small child, their faces deliberately scratched out with what looked like a knife or nail. The photograph's style suggested it dated from the late 1970s, probably during the Hendricks family's brief residence. Someone had tried to destroy it completely, but had failed to ensure total incineration. The deliberate defacement of the faces suggested intense emotion, fear, anger, or desperation that had driven someone to attack even the image of the subjects. Clara pieced together what remained of the photograph on the cabin's kitchen table. Despite the damage, she could make out enough details to see that the child was young, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, and that both subjects were posed formally, as if for a family portrait. The background showed what might be the cabin's interior. Confirming the connection to the property's history, the discovery reinforced the pattern suggested by the Morrison Journal. Families arriving with normal expectations, gradually experiencing unexplained phenomena, and finally leaving in states of fear or desperation that led to destructive behavior. The scratched-out faces spoke of someone trying to erase memory or deny recognition, actions that transcended rational response to ordinary problems. Flint's distress had escalated throughout their exploration, and by afternoon, he was exhibiting behavior Clara had never witnessed. He paced continuously, whining in harmonies that seemed to respond to sounds she couldn't detect. His attention kept fixing on specific points around the cabin, doorways, windows, corners, as if tracking movement through the structure. Most unsettling was his response to the photograph fragments. When Clara arranged them on the table, Flint approached cautiously and then backed away, growling at the images with the same intensity he'd shown toward the hidden key. Whatever was affecting him seemed connected to both the physical objects and the locations where they'd been found. As evening approached, Clara decided to spend the night at the cabin. If she was going to understand what had frightened away 3 families, she needed to experience whatever they had experienced. Her truck contained camping supplies and enough food for several days. Flint could provide early warning of any natural threats, while her father's pistol offered protection against more conventional dangers. The decision felt both logical and terrifying. Clara had spent countless nights alone in the wilderness, but always in places where she understood the environment and its challenges. Ash Hollow represented unknown territory in ways that went beyond simple geography. Still, her practical nature insisted that investigation required commitment, and fear without understanding served no useful purpose. She established a basic camp on the cabin's front porch, where she could observe both the interior and the surrounding forest. Flint initially refused to settle anywhere near the structure, but eventually took a position where he could watch both Clara and the tree line simultaneously. His posture remained tense, alert to threats from multiple directions. The first hour passed quietly. Clara ate a simple dinner while reviewing the documents she'd discovered, trying to piece together a timeline of the property's troubled history. The Morrison Journal provided the most detailed account, but the burned photograph suggested that later families had experienced similar phenomena. The patterns seemed consistent across different decades, implying that whatever was happening wasn't related to specific families, but to the location itself. As darkness deepened around the cabin, Clara began to understand why previous residents had fled. The silence felt oppressive rather than peaceful, as if the normal sounds of forest life had been deliberately suppressed. No owls called, no small animals rustled through the underbrush, no wind stirred the pine branches. Even the settling sounds that marked any old wooden structure had ceased, leaving a quiet so complete it felt unnatural. Flint's agitation increased with the darkness. He began responding to stimuli Clara couldn't detect, turning his head to track movement she couldn't see, growling at empty air, occasionally bolting to his feet as if preparing to defend against some approaching threat. His behavior was so unlike his normal composure that Clara found herself trusting his senses more than her own rational skepticism. Around midnight, she heard it for the first time, a woman's voice calling her name from somewhere inside the cabin. The sound was clear, unmistakable, carrying the kind of urgency that demanded immediate response. But Clara remained on the porch, every instinct warning her against entering the structure in darkness. "Clara," the voice called again, closer now, as if its source had moved toward the front of the cabin. "Clara, I need your help." Flint's response was immediate and terrifying. He positioned himself between Clara and the cabin door, his growls becoming a continuous sound of warning and threat. The dog, who had never shown aggression toward any human, was clearly prepared to fight whatever was calling her name. The voice continued intermittently throughout the night, sometimes pleading, sometimes urgent, always carrying an emotional weight that made ignoring it feel cruel and selfish. But Clara had read the Morrison Journal carefully. She knew that previous residents had responded to similar calls, had tried to help whatever was asking for assistance, and had ultimately fled in terror from their efforts to provide aid. By dawn, Clara understood viscerally what had driven away 3 families. Whatever resided at Ash Hollow possessed intelligence, persistence, and the ability to mimic human distress in ways that challenged every instinct toward compassion and assistance. The rational part of her mind insisted that explanations existed for what she'd experienced, but her deeper understanding recognized that she had encountered something beyond normal comprehension. As the first light broke through the forest canopy, the voice ceased and Flint's tension gradually decreased. The normal sounds of morning, birds calling, wind in the trees, the settling noises of an old wooden structure, returned as if they had been waiting for permission to resume. Clara packed her camping gear with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion and residual fear. She had gotten the answers she'd sought about the cabin's history, but they raised more questions than they resolved. Whatever called her name knew who she was, had targeted her specifically rather than simply responding to human presence. The drive home felt like awakening from a nightmare. Though Clara knew she hadn't been sleeping, Flint's relief was obvious the moment they left the property, his posture relaxing for the first time in days. But even as they put distance between themselves and Ash Hollow, Clara carried the certainty that her encounter with the supernatural was far from over. The voice had known her name, had called to her with the kind of familiarity that suggested prior acquaintance. Whatever resided in that cabin had been waiting specifically for Clara Dawson. And now that contact had been established, she suspected it wouldn't be content to let her simply walk away. Clara spent 3 days at her own cabin, trying to process what she'd experienced at Ash Hollow. But rational analysis proved inadequate for understanding supernatural encounter. The voice had been undeniably real, as had Flint's terrified response, yet both challenged everything she'd believed about the nature of reality. Sleep came poorly, interrupted by dreams where the pleading voice followed her through endless dark corridors. On the 4th morning, Clara made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. She would research the supernatural claims surrounding Ash Hollow with the same methodical approach she applied to any practical problem. if whatever resided there possessed intelligence and specific knowledge about her. She needed to understand its origins and motivations. The Pine Ridge Public Library occupied a converted house on the town's main street. Its collection focused on local history and genealogy rather than contemporary topics. Head librarian Margaret Stone had worked there for 30 years, making her the unofficial keeper of regional memory and stories that never made it into official records. Clara found Margaret in the local history section, organizing documents that had been donated by longtime residents. At 65, Margaret possessed the kind of institutional memory that made her invaluable for research into events that predated digital records. "Clara Dawson," Margaret said, looking up from a box of old photographs. "I heard you bought the Ash Hollow place at auction. Planning to tear it down for the timber?" "Maybe," Clara replied carefully. "But I'd like to understand its history first. Bill Morrison mentioned there were problems with previous residents." Margaret's expression grew cautious. "What kind of problems are you experiencing?" The question suggested Margaret knew more than casual gossip about the property's history. Clara decided on partial honesty. "My dog won't go near the place. Acts like there's something there that threatens him. I found some old journal pages that mention similar issues with other families." "The Morrison Journal," Margaret said, nodding slowly. "Robert Morrison showed me those pages back in 1943, before they left town. He was a rational man, not given to flights of fancy. What he documented there troubled him deeply." Margaret led Clara to a back room where older records were stored in filing cabinets that looked like they'd been acquired second-hand decades ago. She pulled out a folder marked Ash Hollow Mining District and spread its contents on a reading table. "This is everything I've been able to gather about that area over the years," Margaret explained. "Official records, newspaper clippings, personal accounts. Most of it dates back to the 1880s, when the mining operation was active. The documents painted a picture of tragedy that explained much about the supernatural activity Clara had witnessed. The Ash Hollow mine had been operated by Jeremiah Blackthorne, a businessman from Denver who had purchased mining claims throughout the region during the Colorado silver boom. Unlike other operations that employed local miners, Blackthorne had brought in workers from Mexico and South America, men who had few connections to the local community and whose disappearances might go unnoticed. The mining operation had lasted only 3 years, from 1884 to 1887, but during that time more than 30 miners had died in what official records classified as industrial accidents. Cave-ins, equipment failures, gas explosions. The Ash Hollow mine had experienced every type of mining disaster at rates that far exceeded normal industry standards. "Look at this," Margaret said, pointing to a newspaper clipping from the Denver Post dated September 1887. "Mine. Closed after final tragedy claims 6 lives." The reporter noted that Blackthorne sealed the mine immediately after the last accident, rather than investigating the cause or recovering the bodies. Clara read the article carefully, noting details that hadn't been included in other documents. Witnesses reported that the final explosion had been visible from several miles away, suggesting it involved more than accidental ignition of natural gas. The surviving miners had refused to return to work, claiming they'd been hearing voices in the deepest tunnels that spoke of deliberate sabotage and murder. "Jeremiah Blackthorne disappeared right after sealing the mine," Margaret continued. "Left town overnight, sold his properties through lawyers, never returned to Colorado. But here's what's interesting. 3 months later, his body was found in a Denver hotel room. Natural causes, according to the coroner, but witnesses said he'd been talking obsessively about voices that followed him wherever he went. The historical pattern began to clarify for Clara. If Blackthorne had been deliberately causing mining accidents to cover up theft or fraud, the men who died in those tunnels would have been victims of murder rather than industrial mishap. Their bodies had never been recovered, never received proper burial, never been mourned by families who might never have learned their fate. What about the cabin? Clara asked. When was it built? Margaret consulted another document. 1888, the year after the mine closed. Blackthorne had it constructed as housing for a caretaker who was supposed to maintain the sealed mine. But no caretaker ever stayed more than a few weeks. The place has been abandoned and reoccupied periodically ever since. A pattern emerged that connected the supernatural activity to historical injustice. The voice that had called Clara's name, the disturbances that had driven away multiple families, the sealed mine with its memorial flowers, all pointed to spirits seeking recognition for crimes that had been covered up and forgotten. Clara studied a map of the mining district, noting that her own family's property bordered the original claims. Were any of my relatives involved in the mining operation? Margaret consulted a genealogical chart she'd assembled over years of research. Your great-great-grandfather, Thomas Dawson, worked at the Ash Hollow mine for several months in 1887. According to employment records, he was one of the survivors who refused to return after the final explosion. The personal connection explained why the supernatural entity had known Clara's name, why it had seemed to be waiting specifically for her arrival. She wasn't a random purchaser of distressed property. She was a descendant of someone who had witnessed Blackthorne's crimes and lived to tell about them. Is Thomas Dawson mentioned in any other records? Clara asked. Margaret produced a folder of statements taken by county officials investigating the mine closure. Thomas Dawson's account was among them, written in the careful handwriting of someone who understood the importance of accurate testimony. The foreman told us to set charges deeper than was safe. Said the owner wanted to reach ore that wasn't there. When Miguel Santos questioned the placement, he was sent down alone to check the lower tunnels. We heard the explosion from outside. When we went down to find him, the tunnel had collapsed and been sealed with fresh timber. They told us it was an accident, but Miguel's tools were still up top. He never went down with what he needed to do the work they claimed he was doing. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she read her ancestors' words. Thomas Dawson had witnessed murder and been powerless to prevent it or seek justice. The final explosion that killed 6 miners had been the culmination of a pattern of deliberate sabotage, designed to eliminate witnesses and cover up theft. Did Thomas ever try to report what he'd seen to authorities? Several times, Margaret replied, but Blackthorne had connections in Denver, and the miners were mostly foreigners without legal standing. Thomas's statements were taken but never acted upon. He eventually moved his family away from the mining district and never spoke publicly about what he'd witnessed. Clara understood now why the supernatural entity had been waiting for her. As Thomas Dawson's descendant, she represented the possibility of finally bringing truth to light and providing justice for crimes that had been buried for more than a century. The voice calling her name hadn't been seeking to harm her. It had been asking for help from someone with both the family, connection, and the resources to investigate what really happened at the Ash Hollow mine, but understanding the entity's motivation didn't resolve Clara's dilemma. Providing the justice that was being sought would require exposing historical crimes that powerful people might still want to keep hidden. Jeremiah Blackthorne might be long dead, but his descendants and associates could have ongoing interests in maintaining the cover-up. Margaret, Clara said carefully, who else knows about these documents? The librarian's expression grew troubled. That's a good question. These records have been here for years. But most people aren't interested in old mining history. Though now that you mention it, Mayor Blackthorne has asked several times about materials related to the early mining period. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. Mayor Blackthorne? Is he related to Jeremiah? His great-great-grandson, Margaret confirmed. Marcus has been mayor for 12 years, very interested in local history and economic development. He's been particularly focused on acquiring properties in the old mining district for what he calls heritage tourism. The connection explained much about the cabin's auction price and availability. If Mayor Blackthorne knew about his ancestors' crimes and wanted to prevent investigation, Ensuring the property remained unused or was demolished would serve his interests. Clara's purchase for $1 hadn't been the bargain she'd thought. It had been a trap designed to put the property in the hands of someone who would simply tear down the cabin without exploring its history. But the plan had failed because Marcus Blackthorne hadn't anticipated that Clara would investigate rather than demolish, or that she possessed family connections to the original crimes that made her receptive to supernatural contact. "I need to study these documents more carefully," Clara told Margaret. "Would it be possible to make copies?" "Of course, though I should mention that several items are missing from the collection. Documents that were definitely here a few years ago seem to have disappeared. I've always assumed they were misfiled, but now I'm wondering if someone might have deliberately removed them." Clara spent the rest of the afternoon reading through every available document, taking careful notes and making copies of the most significant items. By evening, she had assembled a clear picture of systematic murder covered up by official corruption, with her own ancestor serving as a witness whose testimony had been ignored and suppressed. The supernatural entity seeking justice wasn't some random ghost story. It was Miguel Santos, the miner who had been murdered in the lower tunnels, still trying to expose the truth about his death and the deaths of his fellow workers. The voice calling her name belonged to someone who had been waiting more than a century for a member of the Dawson family to return and finish what Thomas Dawson had tried to start. As Clara drove home through mountain darkness, she carried more than historical documents. She carried the weight of family obligation and the knowledge that her ancestors' failure to obtain justice had created a debt that could only be paid by confronting the present day descendants of the men who had committed murder and covered it up. Clara spent the evening studying the documents she'd copied from the library, cross-referencing dates and details to build a comprehensive understanding of the Ash Hollow murders. By midnight, she had assembled a timeline that revealed the systematic nature of Jeremiah Blackthorne's crimes and the ongoing cover-up that had protected his reputation for more than a century. The pattern was clear. Miners who questioned unsafe practices or showed signs of discovering Blackthorne's theft were assigned to dangerous areas of the mine where accidents could be arranged. Miguel Santos had been the most vocal critic of the safety violations, making him a primary target. His murder had been witnessed by Thomas Dawson and other miners, but their testimony had been dismissed by corrupt officials who valued Blackthorne's political connections over miners' lives. What made the historical crimes relevant to present circumstances was the evidence that someone was still actively working to suppress the truth. The missing documents from the library, Mayor Blackthorne's interest in acquiring properties in the mining district, the cabin's sale for $1, all suggested ongoing efforts to prevent investigation and exposure. Clara realized she needed more than historical documents to prove current wrongdoing. If Marcus Blackthorne was continuing his ancestors' cover-up, she would need to find evidence of his active involvement in suppressing information about the mining murders. That meant investigating the sealed mine directly, regardless of the supernatural risks involved. The next morning brought unexpected validation of her concerns. Clara found Flint pacing the perimeter of her property, agitated in ways that reminded her of his behavior at Ash Hollow. The dog kept returning to the tree line that faced toward the old mining district, growling at something beyond her ability to detect. Around noon, Clara noticed fresh tire tracks on the forest road that led toward her cabin. The tracks were too recent to have been made by her own vehicle, and they showed the wide pattern of a truck or SUV, rather than the narrower prints left by cars. Someone had been watching her property, probably since her visits to the library and the cabin. The surveillance confirmed that her investigation had attracted attention from people with reasons to prevent her from learning more about the Ash Hollow murders. Clara found herself facing the same situation that had confronted her ancestor, witnessing criminal activity while lacking the resources or connections to obtain justice through official channels. But Clara possessed advantages that Thomas Dawson had lacked. She owned the property where evidence might be found. She understood the supernatural forces that were trying to communicate about the crimes. And she lived in an era where information could be preserved and distributed more effectively than official suppression could prevent. That afternoon, Clara drove to the county offices in Pine Ridge, ostensibly to research property records, but actually to test whether her activities were being monitored. She signed in at the clerk's office, requested files related to mining claims in her area, and spent 2 hours reviewing documents that contained nothing she hadn't already learned from the library. The test proved informative. Within an hour of her departure from the county building, the same vehicle that had left tracks near her property appeared on the road behind her truck. The driver maintained careful distance but stayed with her through several turns that would have been unnecessary for anyone. Traveling to legitimate destinations, Clara led her surveillance through a route that ended at a hardware store where she purchased supplies that could serve multiple purposes: rope, batteries, a more powerful flashlight, and tools that might be useful for either construction or excavation. Her purchases were mundane enough to avoid suspicion while providing equipment she would need for a more thorough investigation. Of the sealed mine, the drive home confirmed that she was being followed by someone with professional training. The surveillance vehicle stayed far enough back to avoid detection by casual observation, but maintained visual contact through terrain that required familiarity with local roads. Either Mayor Blackthorne had access to law enforcement resources, or he was employing private security with relevant experience. That evening, Clara made her decision. Waiting for official investigation or attempting to work through legal channels would only provide more time for evidence to be destroyed and witnesses to be silenced. If the spirits of the murdered miners were seeking justice, she would have to provide it through direct action rather than institutional processes. The plan she developed combined her practical skills with the supernatural assistance that had been offered. She would return to Ash Hollow at night when her surveillance would be less effective and attempt to open the sealed mine. If the spirits could communicate with her and guide her to evidence, she might be able to document the historical crimes in ways that would be difficult to suppress or deny. But first, she needed to understand exactly what kind of supernatural help was available and what risks were involved in accepting it. The voice that had called her name had been seeking assistance, but Clara's experience with the supernatural remained limited to that single encounter. She decided to test the connection by returning to the cabin during daylight, when the supernatural activity seemed less intense but potentially still accessible. If she could establish communication with Miguel Santos or other spirits, she might be able to coordinate their efforts more effectively. The drive to Ash Hollow revealed that her surveillance had adapted to her changed behavior. Instead of following her vehicle directly, the watchers had positioned themselves at observation points along the route where they could monitor her movements without revealing their presence. The professional nature of their surveillance suggested resources that went beyond simple curiosity about her activities. At the cabin, Clara found evidence that others had visited the property since her last trip. Fresh footprints around the building, disturbed dust on the porch, and subtle signs that someone had conducted their own search of the interior. The signs were carefully concealed, but visible to someone who knew what to look for. Most significantly, the hidden compartment where she'd found the journal pages had been discovered and thoroughly searched. The lock had been picked professionally, and the interior showed signs of detailed examination. Someone with considerable resources was working to stay ahead of her investigation, but the spiritual activity remained undisturbed by the physical intrusion. As afternoon faded toward evening, Clara began to sense the same presence that had called her name during her overnight stay. This time, instead of fear, she felt recognition, the presence of someone who had been waiting patiently for her return. The communication began subtly, through changes in temperature and air pressure that Flint detected before Clara consciously noticed them. Cold spots moved through the cabin in patterns that seemed deliberate rather than random, creating pathways that led consistently toward the back door and the forest beyond. Clara followed the guidance, trusting her instincts and Flint's supernatural sensitivity to keep her safe. The path led directly to the sealed mine, but this time the approach felt different, welcomed rather than threatened, as if she were being invited to see what had been hidden rather than warned away from danger. At the mine entrance, the supernatural presence became more focused and urgent. Clara could sense communication attempting to establish itself, though not yet in the clear words she'd heard during her nighttime vigil at the cabin. Instead, she received impressions, images and emotions that conveyed information more directly than language. She saw the mine as it had been in 1887, filled with working miners and the sounds of extraction. She felt the fear that had grown among the workers as accidents became more frequent and suspicious. Most clearly, she experienced the final moments of Miguel Santos, trapped in a deliberately collapsed tunnel while knowing that his death was murder rather than accident. The communication carried more than historical information. Clara understood that the spirits were offering active assistance in exposing the truth, but that such help would require her to enter the mine and confront both physical dangers and supernatural forces that had been contained by the concrete barriers. For more than a century, as darkness gathered around the mine entrance, Clara made her final decision. The murdered miners had waited long enough for justice, and their descendants deserved to know the truth about what had happened to their ancestors. If spiritual assistance was available to help her succeed where official investigation had failed, she would accept whatever risks were involved. But first, she needed to prepare more thoroughly for an undertaking that would combine archaeological excavation with supernatural investigation. The spirits might be willing to help, but they couldn't protect her from physical dangers or guarantee her safety if Mayor Blackthorne decided to prevent her investigation through violent means. Clara's childhood in the mountains had taught her that the most dangerous challenges required the most careful preparation. Tomorrow night, she would attempt to open the sealed mine and learn the full truth about the Ash Hollow murders. Tonight, she would make sure she was equipped to survive whatever she might find in those dark tunnels. Clara returned home that evening with a clear plan for investigating the sealed mine. But her preparations were interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Mayor Marcus Blackthorne's SUV sat in her driveway, the man himself waiting on her front porch with the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through persistence rather than force. At 55, Marcus Blackthorne possessed the kind of practiced charm that marked successful politicians. His appearance was carefully managed, expensive outdoor clothing that suggested capability without ostentation, silver hair that conveyed wisdom and trustworthiness. But Clara noted details that contradicted the public image. Hands too soft for real outdoor work, boots too clean for genuine mountain travel, and eyes that calculated constantly rather than engaging genuinely. "Miss Dawson," he said, rising as she approached, "I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit. I wanted to discuss your recent purchase of the Ash Hollow property." Clara maintained neutral politeness while studying his body language for signs of threat or deception. "What about it? I understand you've been researching the property's history. As someone who cares deeply about our community's heritage, I thought I might be able to help with your questions." The offer felt like a trap, but Clara recognized an opportunity to learn more about current efforts to suppress information about the mining murders. "I'd appreciate any information you can provide." Marcus settled back onto the porch steps, uninvited but projecting easy familiarity. "The Ash Hollow area has always been problematic for development. Geological instability from the old mining operations makes it unsuitable for construction, and the isolation limits its commercial potential. Most people who've tried to use the property have found it more trouble than it's worth." "Is that why it's sold for $1? "Partly, but there are also liability concerns related to the sealed mine. The county wanted to transfer responsibility to a private owner rather than maintain ongoing oversight of a hazardous site. Clara noted that Marcus displayed detailed knowledge about the property's legal status and the county's motivations for selling it. His information was too specific to come from casual interest in local real estate. "Have you visited the property recently?" she asked. Marcus's pause was brief but telling. "I drive past occasionally as part of my regular rounds through the district." Rural mayors need to stay familiar with all areas under their jurisdiction. The lie was smoothly delivered, but contradicted by evidence Clara had observed. The footprints at the cabin and the professional search of the hidden compartment suggested visits that went far beyond casual inspection. "I've been learning about the mining history," Clara said. "Fascinating how many accidents occurred at that particular site. Industrial mining was dangerous work in those days. Safety regulations were primitive compared to modern standards." Marcus's tone remained conversational, but Clara detected increased attention to her words. "I hope you're not taking old stories too seriously. Local folklore tends to exaggerate historical events. What about the official records? Newspaper accounts from the time seem fairly specific about the problems at the Ash Hollow mine." This time Marcus's pause was longer, and his expression showed calculation rather than surprise. "You've been doing quite a bit of research. May I ask what you're hoping to accomplish?" The question revealed more than Marcus probably intended. Someone conducting casual inquiries wouldn't warrant such focused attention from the mayor. His presence at her cabin, combined with the surveillance she'd detected, suggested organized effort to monitor and potentially control her investigation. "I'm trying to understand what I bought," Clara replied carefully. "The property has an unusual history, and I want to make informed decisions about how to use it." "What kind of decisions? Whether to restore the cabin, salvage the materials, or simply let nature reclaim the site? That depends partly on whether there are any historical restrictions or community concerns I should consider." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his body language shifting toward greater intensity. "What if I told you the community would prefer to see the site developed into something more appropriate for modern use? Something that could contribute to local economic growth rather than preserving reminders of unfortunate historical events?" The suggestion felt like a negotiation opening rather than casual conversation. Clara recognized that Marcus was testing her willingness to abandon her investigation in exchange for financial incentives. "What did you have in mind?" "The county has been considering a heritage tourism initiative focused on the positive aspects of our mining history. Clean sites, educational displays, activities that would bring visitors and revenue to the area. The Ash Hollow property could be part of that development if it were managed by people with appropriate vision and resources." "Are you offering to buy the property from me?" "I'm suggesting we might be able to work together in ways that would benefit everyone involved. You'd receive fair compensation for your investment. The community would gain economic development, and problematic historical issues could be resolved appropriately." Clara understood that she was being offered a bribe to abandon her investigation, though Marcus was careful to frame it as legitimate business opportunity. The size of the incentive suggested that powerful interests were threatened by what she might discover about the Ash Hollow murders. "How much compensation are we talking about?" Marcus named a figure that represented more money than Clara had ever possessed, enough to upgrade her entire homestead, purchase new equipment, and live comfortably for years without needing outside income. The offer was generous enough to tempt anyone facing financial uncertainty, and clearly calculated to resolve the situation through economic rather than other means. "That's a substantial offer for property I bought for $1. The dollar sale price reflected the county's eagerness to transfer liability and responsibility. Private development could transform a problematic site into a community asset, which justifies premium compensation. Clara pretended to consider the offer while actually studying Marcus's demeanor for additional information about his motivations and resources. His confidence suggested he was accustomed to resolving problems through financial incentives, while his specific knowledge about her investigation implied access to surveillance capabilities that exceeded normal mayoral authority. "I'd need to think about it," she said finally. "This is a significant decision that would affect my long-term plans." "Of course. But I should mention that the development timeline is somewhat urgent. Environmental and safety concerns require resolution sooner rather than later, and there are federal regulations that could complicate private ownership if certain issues aren't addressed promptly." The veiled threat was unmistakable. If Clara didn't accept the buyout offer, she could expect legal or regulatory problems that would make keeping the property difficult or expensive. Marcus was providing both carrot and stick, giving her clear incentives to cooperate while hinting at consequences for refusal. "How soon would you need an answer?" "Within a few days would be ideal. Community planning requires certainty, and we can't move forward with the Heritage Tourism Initiative until the Ash Hollow situation is resolved." After Marcus left, Clara sat on her porch, processing what she'd learned from their conversation. The mayor's visit had confirmed her suspicions about organized efforts to prevent investigation of the historical murders. But it had also revealed the extent of current surveillance and control operations. Most significantly, Marcus's offer suggested that powerful interests were willing to pay substantial sums to maintain the cover-up that had protected Jeremiah Blackthorne's reputation for more than a century. Such ongoing investment in suppressing historical truth implied that exposure of the original crimes could threaten present-day interests in ways that went beyond family embarrassment. Clara realized she'd been thinking too small about the scope of the conspiracy. If Marcus Blackthorne was willing to offer her life-changing money to abandon her investigation, other people with connections to the original cover-up were probably involved in maintaining the secret. The network of corruption that had protected Jeremiah Blackthorne might have expanded over generations to include law enforcement, county officials, and business interests throughout the region. But the conversation had also revealed a crucial vulnerability in the current cover-up. Marcus's urgency about resolving the situation suggested that Clara's investigation was progressing faster than the conspirators had anticipated. Her research at the library, her visits to the cabin, and her discovery of the historical documents had triggered response measures that indicated real concern about what she might uncover. The spiritual assistance she'd been offered took on new significance in this context. If human corruption was protecting the truth about the Ash Hollow murders, supernatural intervention might be the only way to overcome institutional obstacles and expose the historical crimes. The murdered miners weren't just seeking recognition. They were offering to help fight the same system of corruption that had covered up their deaths and continued to operate in the present. Clara's decision was made. She would reject Marcus Blackthorne's offer and proceed with opening the sealed mine, regardless of the risks involved. The spirits of Miguel Santos and his fellow workers had waited more than a century for justice, and they deserved better than abandonment in exchange for financial comfort. But first, she needed to understand exactly how extensive the current conspiracy was and what resources were arrayed against her. If Marcus could offer her tens of thousands of dollars to abandon the investigation, the interests he represented possessed significant wealth and influence. Fighting such forces would require more than individual courage. It would demand strategic thinking and careful preparation for conflicts that could escalate beyond civil disagreement. As darkness settled over Pine Valley, Clara began planning not just for archaeological excavation of a sealed mine, but for a confrontation with corruption that had operated successfully for more than a century. The supernatural forces seeking justice were powerful allies, but they would need to combine their efforts with practical resistance to human opponents who had proven willing to use violence, bribery, and official authority to maintain their secrets. The murdered miners had chosen their champion well. Clara Dawson possessed the mountain-bred toughness and practical skills necessary to fight opponents who thought they could control the situation through money and intimidation. Tomorrow night, she would discover whether spiritual assistance could overcome human corruption, or whether the Ash Hollow murders would remain hidden for another generation. Clara spent the day after Marcus Blackthorn's visit preparing for what she understood would be the decisive confrontation over the Ash Hollow murders. If she succeeded in opening the sealed mine and documenting the evidence inside, the historical crimes could finally be exposed despite more than a century of cover-up. If she failed, the truth would remain buried, and the murdered miners would continue waiting for justice that might never come. Her preparations combined practical mountain skills with strategic thinking about opponents who possessed substantial resources and official authority. Clara had lived her entire life in environments where careful preparation meant the difference between success and disaster, and this situation demanded the most thorough planning she'd ever undertaken. The technical challenges of opening the sealed mine required equipment she didn't currently possess. The concrete barriers and steel plates would need to be removed safely, without triggering collapse or explosion that could destroy evidence while endangering her life. Clara drove to a construction supply company in the valley, purchasing tools and materials under the pretext of home renovation projects. She acquired a portable jackhammer capable of breaking through concrete, cutting tools for steel plate removal, safety equipment including hard hat and breathing protection, and industrial lighting that would allow detailed examination of the mine interior. The purchases were expensive, but not unusual for someone undertaking major property improvements. More challenging was acquiring the explosive charges she would need to clear debris and create safe access to the deeper tunnels, where the most significant evidence was likely to be found. Clara's hunting experience included familiarity with small explosive devices used for clearing beaver dams and breaking up deadfall. But the mine might require larger charges than she could obtain through normal channels. The solution came through contacts in the mountain community who preferred to avoid government regulation of their activities. Clara had grown up among people who valued self-reliance and viewed official oversight with suspicion, creating networks of mutual assistance that operated outside legal oversight. A conversation with her nearest neighbor resulted in acquisition of mining explosives left over from legitimate construction projects. While assembling equipment, Clara also prepared for the human opposition she expected to encounter. Marcus Blackthorn's surveillance capabilities and financial resources suggested he could deploy significant force if economic incentives failed to stop her investigation. Clara needed to be ready for confrontation that could escalate beyond legal or regulatory pressure. Her father's gun cabinet provided weapons, appropriate for various scenarios: a rifle for long-range defense, a shotgun for close-quarters protection, and the pistol she normally carried for wildlife encounters. Clara had been shooting since childhood and maintained proficiency through regular practice. But she'd never fired at human targets and hoped such skills wouldn't be necessary. More importantly, she prepared information that would survive her death or disappearance. Clara wrote detailed accounts of everything she'd discovered about the Ash Hollow murders, copied all relevant documents, and prepared multiple packages for distribution to journalists, law enforcement agencies, and historical societies. If Marcus Blackthorn's associates attempted to silence her, the truth would still be revealed through her documented evidence. The spiritual preparation proved more complex than the practical arrangements. Clara had accepted that supernatural forces were offering to assist her investigation, but she needed to understand exactly what kind of help was available and what risks were involved in accepting it. Her experience with the supernatural remained limited, leaving her uncertain about protocols for working with entities whose motivations she understood, but whose methods remained mysterious. She decided to attempt formal communication with the spirits before entering the mine, establishing clear agreements about cooperation and mutual protection. If Miguel Santos and his fellow miners were seeking justice through her actions, they should be willing to provide guidance and assistance in ways that maximized her chances of success, while minimizing dangers from both physical hazards and human opposition. That evening, Clara returned to the Ash Hollow cabin with camping gear and the ceremonial items she thought might facilitate spiritual communication. She'd researched traditional practices for honoring the dead and seeking their assistance, adapting what she'd learned to her specific situation and cultural background. The approach felt awkward and uncertain. Clara had never participated in formal spiritual ceremonies and worried about appearing foolish or disrespectful. But her practical nature recognized that if supernatural assistance was available, she should pursue it with the same methodical preparation she applied to any other resource. The cabin felt different as darkness gathered around it. The oppressive silence that had characterized her previous visits had been replaced by a sense of anticipation, as if the building itself was waiting for something important to happen. Flint's behavior reflected the change. Instead of fear and agitation, he showed alert readiness, like a hunting dog that had detected game and was preparing for action. Clara established her base camp on the front porch, arranging candles and offerings in patterns she hoped would demonstrate respect for the spirits she was seeking to contact. She'd brought flowers similar to those she'd found at the mine entrance, along with tobacco and other items that traditional sources suggested were appropriate for honoring the dead. The response began subtly, through changes in air pressure and temperature that created a sense of presence without visible manifestation. Clara felt herself being evaluated by intelligences that were deciding whether to trust her with their assistance and their secrets. The communication that developed was unlike anything she'd experienced during previous visits to the property. Instead of the desperate pleading that had characterized her first overnight stay, she sensed organized intelligence offering partnership in pursuit of shared goals. The spirits weren't just seeking help, they were proposing collaboration between the living and the dead to achieve justice that neither could accomplish alone. Clara understood that she was being invited to serve as more than just a representative for the murdered miners. The spirits were offering to work through her, providing guidance and protection that would allow her to navigate dangers that would otherwise be insurmountable. But such assistance would require her to accept their presence in ways that blurred the boundaries between her consciousness and theirs. The prospect was both terrifying and exhilarating. Clara had spent her life valuing independence and self-reliance, making decisions based on her own judgment and capabilities. Accepting spiritual guidance meant surrendering some of that autonomy in exchange for access to knowledge and abilities that transcended normal human limitations, but the alternative was accepting defeat before the confrontation began. Marcus Blackthorne's resources and connections gave him overwhelming advantages in any conventional conflict. If Clara was going to succeed in exposing the historical murders, she needed assistance that could level the playing field between individual determination and institutional corruption. As midnight approached, Clara made her decision. She formally accepted the partnership being offered by the spirits, agreeing to serve as their representative in the physical world, while they provided guidance and protection for her investigation. The agreement felt binding in ways that went beyond verbal commitment, a spiritual contract that would endure until justice had been achieved, or her part in the struggle had ended. The immediate response was profound. Clara felt her awareness expand beyond her normal sensory limitations, providing perception of the surrounding environment that included both physical and spiritual dimensions. She could sense the location and movement of wildlife throughout the forest, detect the presence of human watchers positioned at observation points around the property, and perceive spiritual entities that remained invisible to normal sight. Most significantly, She gained access to the memories and knowledge of the murdered miners. Clara could see the Ash Hollow mine as it had existed in 1887, understand the layout of tunnels and chambers that had been hidden for more than a century, and know exactly where to find evidence that would prove the historical crimes. But the enhanced perception came with corresponding responsibilities. Clara understood that she was now accountable not just for her own success or failure, but for representing the hopes and suffering of men who had been denied justice for generations. The weight of that obligation was sobering, but it also provided determination that transcended her individual concerns about danger or consequences. The spirits also provided practical information about current threats. Clara learned that Marcus Blackthorne had positioned armed men around the property, with orders to prevent her from reaching the mine by whatever means necessary. The surveillance she'd detected was more extensive than she'd realized, and the dangers she faced included immediate physical threat as well as long-term legal or financial retaliation. But the spiritual allies had their own resources for dealing with human opposition. Clara sensed that the murdered miners retained abilities to influence physical events, particularly in locations where their deaths had created strong connections between the spiritual and material worlds. The mine itself was their strongest base of power, where they could provide protection and assistance that would be unavailable in other environments. As dawn approached, Clara felt ready for the confrontation that would determine whether the Ash Hollow murders remained hidden or were finally exposed to public scrutiny. She possessed the equipment necessary for opening the sealed mine, the weapons and skills needed for defending herself against human opposition, and spiritual assistance that would provide guidance and protection throughout the ordeal. Most importantly, she understood that her struggle represented more than personal justice for historical crimes. Clara was fighting against corruption that had operated successfully for more than a century, challenging a system that protected the powerful while sacrificing the innocent. Success would honor not just the murdered miners, but everyone who had been silenced by official indifference and institutional conspiracy. The next night would bring either vindication for the spirits who had waited so long for justice, or another defeat that would prolong their suffering indefinitely. Clara was prepared for either outcome, but determined to ensure that if she failed, it wouldn't be through lack of courage or preparation. The murdered miners had chosen their champion well. Tomorrow, Marcus Blackthorne and his associates would discover that mountain-bred determination, combined with supernatural assistance, created opponents who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or silenced through conventional means. The final battle for the truth about Ash Hollow was about to begin. Clara approached the sealed mine at 3 a.m, moving through forest darkness with the enhanced perception provided by her spiritual allies. She could sense the armed men Marcus Blackthorne had positioned around the property. 6 watches spread through concealed positions that would allow them to converge on the mine, entrance within minutes of detecting her presence. But the spirits guided her along paths that avoided human detection while remaining accessible to someone carrying the heavy equipment needed for opening the concrete barriers. Clara had never moved through wilderness with such confidence during complete darkness, trusting supernatural guidance to keep her safe from both natural hazards and human threats. The mine entrance appeared, exactly as the spiritual memories had shown her, a concrete and steel barrier that looked formidable, but had been designed for speed rather than permanence. The construction showed stress cracks and weathering that would make removal easier than the original builders had intended. More importantly, Clara could sense what lay beyond the barriers: open tunnels, preserved chambers, and evidence that would prove the historical murders beyond any possibility of denial. She assembled her equipment quietly, using hand signals and whispered communication with Flint to coordinate their efforts. The dog's supernatural sensitivity had increased dramatically since Clara's formal alliance with the spirits, allowing him to serve as an early warning system for both human approach and spiritual activity. The jackhammer made noise that would certainly attract attention, but Clara had planned for that inevitability. She activated the explosive charges she'd placed at strategic points around the property perimeter, small devices that created distractions rather than serious damage, but would confuse and delay any response to her activities at the mine entrance. The concrete barrier yielded more easily than expected, cracking along existing stress lines and revealing the steel plates underneath. Clara used cutting tools to remove enough metal to create access, working with desperate efficiency while listening for sounds of approaching opposition. Behind her, Flint's growls indicated that the human watchers were responding to the explosions and moving toward the mine entrance. But his attention also focused on the opening Clara was creating, suggesting that spiritual activity was increasing as the barriers were removed. The first opening released air that had been trapped in the mine for more than a century, stale atmosphere that carried scents of earth, metal, and something else that made both Clara and Flint recoil instinctively. But mixed with the unpleasant odors was something that felt like relief, as if entities that had been confined were finally able to move freely. Clara squeezed through the opening she'd created and found herself in a tunnel that extended into the mountain beyond the reach of her flashlight beam. The construction was more elaborate than she'd expected. Carefully engineered passages with timber supports that had survived decades of neglect. But underlying the structural evidence was a spiritual presence so intense it felt like physical pressure. The murdered miners were here, waiting for her in the darkness where their lives had ended. Clara could sense their gratitude for her arrival and their eagerness to guide her to evidence that would finally expose the truth about their deaths. But she could also feel their anger, more than a century of rage at the injustice they'd suffered and the cover-up that had protected their killers. Behind her, sounds of human activity indicated that Marcus Blackthorne's men had overcome the confusion created by her diversionary explosions and were approaching the mine entrance. Clara had perhaps 10 minutes before they arrived in force. Possibly less, if they chose to use more aggressive tactics than she'd anticipated. The spirits urged her deeper into the mine, along passages that led to chambers where the most significant evidence had been preserved. But they also warned her about dangers that went beyond human opposition, structural damage that could cause collapse, gases that had accumulated in sealed areas, and spiritual forces that had been contained by the barriers for more than a century. Clara moved carefully but quickly through tunnels that felt simultaneously familiar and alien. The spiritual memories provided knowledge of the mine's layout, but the physical reality included decay and hazards that hadn't existed when the passages were actively maintained. She tested each step for stability while following guidance that led toward increasingly intense supernatural activity. The first chamber she entered contained exactly what the spirits had promised: evidence of the mining murders that had been hidden for more than a century. Personal belongings, mining equipment, and most importantly, human remains that showed clear signs of deliberate violence rather than accidental death. But Clara's examination was interrupted by sounds from the mine entrance that indicated her time was running out. Marcus Blackthorne's men had arrived and were preparing to enter the mine themselves, bringing weapons and equipment that suggested they were prepared for armed confrontation rather than negotiation. The spirit's response was immediate and overwhelming. Clara felt supernatural rage that had been building for generations focus itself on the human threats approaching through the tunnels. The murdered miners weren't just seeking justice, they were preparing to take revenge on the descendants of the men who had killed them and covered up their crimes. The final confrontation was beginning, and Clara found herself at the center of a conflict that spanned more than a century and involved forces from both the physical and spiritual worlds. The supernatural forces protecting Clara manifested with an intensity that transformed the mine from a historical site into an active battlefield between the living and the dead. As Marcus Blackthorne's armed men entered the tunnels, They encountered opposition that their training and equipment couldn't address, attacks from entities that existed beyond the reach of conventional weapons. Clara heard screams and gunshots echoing through the passages as the hired security team faced opponents they couldn't see or understand. The spirits of the murdered miners had been waiting more than a century for the opportunity to confront their killer's descendants, and their rage expressed itself through physical effects that trapped and terrorized the living intruders. But the spiritual battle provided more than protection for Clara's investigation. In the deepest chamber of the mine, she discovered what Miguel Santos had died trying to protect, a cache of documents and evidence that Jeremiah Blackthorne had hidden rather than destroyed when he fled Colorado in 1887. The hidden materials included financial records proving systematic theft from mining operations throughout the region, correspondence with corrupt officials who had helped cover up the murders, and most significantly, a detailed confession written by Blackthorne himself before his death in Denver. The historical villain had documented his crimes in explicit detail, apparently hoping to clear his conscience, even if he couldn't face legal consequences. Clara photographed every document with her phone's camera while the supernatural battle raged in the tunnels around her. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, proof that would expose not just the original murders, but the ongoing conspiracy that had protected Blackthorne's reputation for more than a century. Among the preserved items, Clara found Miguel Santos's personal effects, including a gold wedding ring that had belonged to his wife Maria. The ring served as a focal point for the spiritual energy that had been seeking justice for so long. And when Clara touched it, she experienced the final moments of Miguel's life with devastating clarity. She saw him discovering Blackthorne's hidden cache, understanding that exposure of the documents would save his fellow miners from further accidents. She felt his determination to protect the evidence even when he realized that Blackthorne's men were coming to silence him permanently. Most powerfully, she experienced his final prayer that someday someone would find what he died defending and bring justice to all the murdered workers. The ring grew warm in Clara's hand, and she understood that Miguel Santos's spirit could finally find peace. His mission was complete. The evidence had been discovered, documented, and would soon be revealed to the world. But first, the immediate physical danger had to be resolved. Marcus Blackthorne himself appeared in the chamber entrance, having followed his fleeing security team into the mine despite the supernatural chaos around them. He carried a pistol and wore the desperate expression of someone whose entire world was collapsing around him. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "Those documents will destroy more than just my family's reputation. There are businesses, political careers, financial arrangements that depend on keeping the past buried." Clara backed against the far wall of the chamber, still clutching Miguel Santos's wedding ring. 37 men were murdered to protect those arrangements. They deserve justice more than you deserve protection. Justice for dead men who've been gone for over a century. What about justice for the living people who will be ruined by ancient crimes they had nothing to do with? You've spent your entire political career actively covering up those crimes. You're not an innocent victim. You're a willing participant in the conspiracy. Marcus raised his pistol, but before he could fire, the supernatural forces in the mine reached their climax. The accumulated rage of 37 murdered miners focused itself on the descendant of their killer, creating physical effects that sent him sprawling across the rocky floor. But the spiritual intervention went beyond simple protection for Clara. Miguel Santos's spirit, empowered by the recovery of his wedding ring and the exposure of the hidden evidence, manifested with enough physical presence to directly confront Marcus Blackthorne. Clara watched in amazement as the mine filled with translucent figures, the spirits of all the murdered miners, finally able to reveal themselves and claim the justice they'd been denied for more than a century. Marcus saw them too, his terrified expression confirming that the spiritual manifestation was visible to everyone present. The spirits didn't attack Marcus physically, but their presence conveyed judgment and condemnation that was more powerful than any human court could provide. They surrounded him while Clara escaped through passages they cleared for her, carrying the documented evidence that would finally expose the truth about the Ash Hollow murders. Behind her, she heard Marcus Blackthorn's voice calling desperately for forgiveness from men he'd helped keep silent for decades. But the spirits had waited too long for justice to accept apologies from someone who had actively perpetuated their suffering. Clara emerged from the mine as dawn broke over the Colorado mountains, carrying proof that would transform historical understanding of the region's mining period and destroy the political career of everyone involved in the modern cover-up. The murdered miners had achieved their goal. The truth would finally be told, and their deaths would be acknowledged and honored. But the spiritual battle had also provided something more precious than historical vindication. Miguel Santos and his fellow workers could finally rest, their mission completed and their sacrifices recognized. The supernatural forces that had haunted Ash Hollow for more than a century were free to move on, leaving behind only memory and the evidence needed to ensure that justice would finally be served. 6 months after the confrontation at the Ash Hollow mine, Clara stood before a granite memorial stone she had commissioned and placed at the mine entrance. The marker bore the names of all 37 miners who had been murdered by Jeremiah Blackthorn's conspiracy, finally providing the recognition and honor they had been denied for more than a century. The inscription read simply, "In memory of the miners who died seeking justice at Ash Hollow, 1884-1887. Their courage exposed corruption and their sacrifice demanded truth. May their spirits finally rest in peace." Clara had funded the memorial with money from the book and documentary deals that followed her exposure of the historical murders. The evidence she'd photographed in the mine had created a media sensation that reached far beyond Colorado, sparking investigations into other mining operations where similar crimes might have been covered up. Marcus Blackthorn's political career had ended the night he disappeared into the Ash Hollow mine. His body was found 3 days later in the deepest chamber, apparently dead from a heart attack brought on by terror and exposure. The coroner's report noted that he'd been found clutching a confession he'd written in his final hours, admitting to decades of actively suppressing evidence about his ancestors' crimes. The confession had provided additional evidence that strengthened the case against the historical conspiracy, while exposing the modern network of corruption that had protected Blackthorn family interests. Federal investigators had uncovered financial crimes, official misconduct, and civil rights violations that led to prosecutions throughout Colorado's political and business establishment. But for Clara, the most important result was the peace that had settled over Ash Hollow. The supernatural activity that had terrorized multiple families had ceased completely once the truth was revealed, and the murdered miners received proper recognition. The cabin stood empty but no longer haunted, while the mine had been converted into a historical site where visitors could learn about both the crimes and their eventual exposure. Clara had chosen to keep the property rather than sell it, transforming the cabin into a research center focused on historical justice and the rights of workers throughout the mining industry. The facility hosted scholars, journalists, and activists who were investigating similar cases of corporate crime and official corruption in other locations and time periods. The work provided Clara with purpose that transcended her previous isolation and self-sufficiency. Instead of living apart from human community, she now served as a bridge between past and present, helping ensure that historical crimes weren't forgotten and that victims of injustice received recognition they'd been denied. Flint remained her constant companion, though his supernatural sensitivity had diminished as the spiritual activity at Ash Hollow decreased. He still showed unusual awareness of things beyond normal perception, but his alertness now focused on protecting Clara rather than warning about supernatural threats. The dog seemed to understand that their mission had succeeded and that he could return to more ordinary concerns. Clara's relationship with the wider community had changed dramatically since the revelation of the mining murders. Instead of being viewed as an eccentric hermit, she was now recognized as someone who had risked everything to expose truth and seek justice for the forgotten dead. The respect she'd gained came not from her isolation but from her willingness to engage with the world when moral obligation demanded action. The historical research had also revealed Clara's deeper connection to the region's mining heritage. Thomas Dawson, her great-great-grandfather, had been more than just a witness to Jeremiah Blackthorne's crimes. He'd been part of an organized effort by surviving miners to document and expose the murders. His testimony, dismissed at the time, had been preserved in family records that Clara's father had never shared with her. Understanding that connection had provided Clara with a sense of completion that went beyond individual accomplishment. She was continuing work that her ancestor had begun, fulfilling obligations that had been passed down through generations, even when the specific knowledge had been lost. The cabin's transformation into a research center had also attracted other descendants of the murdered miners, families who had preserved stories and documents for generations while waiting for official recognition of their ancestors' sacrifice. Clara found herself at the center of a community united by shared history and commitment to ensuring that such crimes were never repeated or forgotten. Most surprisingly, Clara had discovered that her preference for solitude didn't conflict with her new role as a historical advocate and community organizer. The work required interaction with many people, but it was purpose-driven rather than social, focused on achieving specific goals rather than maintaining relationships for their own sake. On quiet evenings, Clara still sat on her porch with her father's walking stick, watching stars emerge over Pine Valley while reflecting on the journey that had brought her from skeptical hermit to spiritual medium to historical detective. The transformation had been profound, but it felt natural rather than forced, as if she'd finally discovered what she was meant to be doing with the skills and knowledge she'd accumulated. The supernatural experiences had changed her understanding of reality in ways that influenced every aspect of her life. Clara no longer dismissed phenomena that couldn't be explained through conventional means, and she'd developed sensitivity to spiritual activity that occasionally proved useful in her research work. But the most important lesson from her encounter with the murdered miners was that isolation and self-sufficiency were incomplete responses to the challenges of existence. Sometimes moral obligation required engagement with the world, acceptance of risk, and commitment to causes that transcended individual comfort and security. As winter settled over the Colorado mountains, Clara prepared for another season of research and documentation, helping other families discover truth about ancestors whose stories had been suppressed by powerful interests. The work would continue for years, possibly decades, but she faced it with the satisfaction of someone who had found her true calling. The spirits of Miguel Santos and his fellow miners had given her more than assistance in exposing historical crimes. They had shown her that justice delayed wasn't necessarily justice denied, and that courage applied at the right moment could overcome corruption that had operated successfully for generations. Clara Dawson had learned that sometimes the most important purchases cost far more than their apparent price, but they also provided value that couldn't be measured in conventional terms. Her $1 cabin had cost her isolation and skepticism, but it had given her purpose, community, and the knowledge that she'd helped 37 murdered men finally find the peace they'd been seeking for more than a century.